In the last decade, it's become popular to say that the Mongol Empire, and its founder, Genghis Khan in particular, killed so many people that it caused the Earth's climate to cool. In the last few days, I have had the misfortune to have a particularly irritating video sent to me about it on TikTok. So, I've tracked down the article that made this claim and we are going to evaluate it. The claim was popularized in a 2011 article by Dr. Julia Pongratz et al., published in the scientific journal The Holocene. In it, Dr. Pongratz notes how drops in CO2 levels from ice core samples corresponded to certain dramatic periods of war, epidemics, and destruction. Mass casualty events in pre-industrial societies which resulted in decreases in agricultural production. Over time, the abandoned farmland is reclaimed by natural vegetation and tree cover, and eventually reabsorbs more CO2 from the air. On a large enough scale, she suggests, this can be observed in regional and atmospheric reductions in the levels of CO2, which can be in turn measured in the annual buildup of snow and ice at Earth's poles. There are some caveats here which are emphasized in her article. Namely, it takes a very long time, decades or centuries, for this vegetation buildup to reach a level where it is actually collecting more carbon from the air than it discharges through initial decomposition and soil release. Therefore, in order to have an extensive, measurable impact and perhaps even global effect, the abandonment of farmland needs to not just be large scale, but long term. So, in her article, while the Black Death killed a third of Europe and results in the widespread abandonment of farmland, the 53-year period she gives for it is too brief for this to have global effects. Recovery simply begins too quickly for this to be anything other than a small blip. But then we get to the Mongols. The article notes that the Mongol Conquests, by not just killing 40 million people, but also occurring over a 180-year period, is the only event where the population is pushed down enough, for long enough, for enough environmental reclamation to take place to result in notable carbon reabsorption. 700 million tons worth of carbon, the equivalent of a year's worth of large-scale coal and oil production today, as Dr. Pongratz told the Daily Mail in an interview. And the Daily Mail, as a nice British rag, summarized this with the subtle title of Genghis Khan the GREEN. And since then, this has been spun into the Mongols killing so many people that so many trees grew that the Earth's climate cooled. And what more evidence do you need? Since the Little Ice Age happened in the 14th century, everything was cold and wet. What a nice, neat little bow. But let's take a look at Dr. Pongratz's claims for the Mongols. Now, I cannot question her science or her formula. I am not a scientist and I'm going to trust her math. But I am a historian. So let's assess what she says about the Mongol conquests. Firstly, she is not talking about the Mongol conquests as a whole. Rather, the calculation with the Mongols here is focused on the wars in China. It's from the wars in China that we get the figure of perhaps 40 million people killed, which seems to be supported by Chinese census data. But we won't get into that here. Instead, let us look at the date range she gives and the problems with it. One of the key parts of her argument is that this population and agricultural decline needs to be large scale and long lasting. So the Black Death at 50 years is too brief, but the 180-year range she gives for the Mongol conquests is sufficient. But here's the question. How long did the Mongol conquests go for? And here I suspect Dr. Pongratz did not, but give a quick Google for this and received 1380 as an end date. Why 1380? 1380 itself is not a year of significance for the Yuan dynasty. They were pushed from China in 1368. Togun Temür Han died in 1370, and the last Yuan holdouts in Yunnan province fell to the Ming in 1382. But 1380 does mark one famous thing, the Battle of Kulikovo, an overblown skirmish between Dmitry Donskoy, Prince of Moscow, and the Beylaribey Mamai of the Golden Horde. Fought in what is now Russia, it is sometimes claimed to be the end of Mongol rule over the Rus, although it was not that. While it remains, though, a popular decline point for the Mongols in some circles, it is not the end of the Mongol conquests. In fact, it's actually much too late for that. See, the Mongol conquests did not take 180 years. The actual periods of conquest, wherein the Mongols were not just conquering lands outside of Mongolia, but engaging in large-scale massacres of agricultural populations at the scale necessary by the article's argument is much shorter. We can measure that roughly from 1208, the first large Mongol attack on the Tangut Kingdom, to 1279, when Hubei Han's armies defeated the last of the Song dynasty holdouts and completed the conquest of China. While military activities continue past this date, they are much less common and not on comparable scale, and often rarely accompanied by wholesale massacres of the civilian population. Rather, they're generally on a destruction level closer to regular warfare in a given region. These campaigns after 1279 do not see any lasting conquests or prolonged warfare that results in the depopulation and abandonment for decades, at least not long enough to measurably impact CO2 levels compared to the fighting of, say, the exceptionally destructive 1230s. An argument could be made to even narrow this down further, to the most destructive period, which is 1210 to 1260. But sticking with 1208 to 1279, we are left with 71 years. Recall how the article had the Black Death's range of 53 years as too short, despite killing an estimated minimum 75 million people? Well, if we take the Mongols as killing 40 million people over a 71-year period, is that really a greater impact? There's a further issue with this date range. The keen-eyed among you might note Dr. Pongratz's supplied range means that the Black Death and the Mongol Conquests overlap. The Black Death was not isolated in Europe. In this period, it also occurred in the lands of the Chagatai Khanate, Ilkhanate, and Golden Horde, and potentially in China too, though there is no conclusive evidence for that. So my question then would be, how would you differentiate, in this overlap, between carbon loss to land abandoned due to plague, the Mongols, or both, or the resulting instability? When the Yuan dynasty collapsed, there was epidemic, warfare between not just Mongols and Chinese rebels, but Chinese factions fighting for each other for their right to succeed the Yuan dynasty. The largest battles are actually between Chinese armies in this period. Coupled with the possibility of the Black Death there too, then is it accurate to attribute deaths after 1340 to the Mongol conquests? This is my problem with these sorts of estimates and claims. They seem to line up really nicely and accurately when you step back very far from them, but the closer you get and the more detail you examine them in, it becomes very difficult to ascribe these to single factors. And indeed, global atmospheric CO2 levels should not be ascribed to single events. The article notes in its conclusion that many researchers attribute these changes in CO2 levels not to wars, but to the Little Ice Age, a general climatic trend towards cooler and wetter temperatures which began in the 13th century and had dramatic impacts in the 14th century. In Europe, for instance, there was widespread famine and starvation from overly wet and cool weather before the plague even hit. When it did hit, it was hitting a population greatly weakened through malnutrition. Were the Mongols responsible for cooler temperatures on Earth in the 13th and 14th century? Almost certainly not. The volcanic eruption of Samalaz in the 1250s, for instance, had a greater impact on global climate than the Mongols did. The Mongol conquests happened to precede global cooling trends brought on by the Little Ice Age, and in the early 13th century, the Mongols may have benefited from wetter conditions in Mongolia, which accompanied these gradual climatic shifts. The resulting deaths and abandonment of farmland caused by Mongol invasions did probably have some impact on global carbon levels, but not nearly as dramatic as popularly presented. And personally, I would think that it was less than what we associate with the Black Death. Furthermore, we could point to the Golden Horde in the 14th century, where we see an expansion of farmland in the Volga steppes to support growing cities in that region, and other reconstructive efforts undertaken by various Mongol governments, to suggest that the amount of agricultural land left to follow is not nearly as extensive as the study implies. In short, the article's premise relies on deliberately presenting the Mongol conquests as almost 2 centuries of continued destructive warfare, when in fact it was approximately 70 years of conquest followed by comparatively less destructive raiding, incursions, or rebellions. This is not to minimize the scale or destruction of the conquests, but simply to accurately report their length of time. In turn, the popular presentation of the Mongols changing the global climate comes from further misrepresentation of this article and its data, and making the Little Ice Age a consequence of the Mongols. Please do not learn history from a British tabloid or a guy who uses a random Google search as evidence in a TikTok video. While there was a drop in global CO2 levels, even the original article does not present it as dramatically as popularly portrayed, and it cannot be unequivocally connected to the Mongol conquests. Based on the argumentation of this article, if the Black Death did not make a significant difference in the carbon levels, then the Mongol conquests did not either. The global climate is a massively complex thing not subject to any single factor. A decrease in agricultural production may be but an apostrophe within a larger book. Climate is a lot harder to influence without millions of cars, factories, and those rat bastards at Nestle ruining it. While this kind of data is a useful tool, it should not be used in isolation to look at history or humanity. Without sufficient historical background or context, the hard data of a study can be misinterpreted or brought to false ends. History and the humanities give science the context it needs to have meaning for humans. Without it, you simply have data points. And that is a roundabout way of saying, no, Genghis Khan was not the greenest conqueror, so please stop sending me TikToks about it.